To appreciate fully this parable of the Good Samaritan, we must think about how it would have sounded to the people hearing it from the very mouth of Jesus himself. To those listening to Jesus tell this parable 2,000 years ago, this parable would have been extremely shocking. This parable would have been shocking because Jesus makes the hero of this parable a Samaritan. Now that does not sound like a big deal to us. A Samaritan is the only person who helps the injured man in this parable. So what? Well, it might not be a big deal to us, but it would have been a very big deal to the Jewish people listening to Jesus tell this story so long ago. And it would have been a big deal to them, and it would have been very shocking because the Jews at the time of Jesus despised and absolutely hated the Samaritans. The Jews hated the Samaritans because they felt that the Samaritans were heretics, that they had left the true faith of Israel, and that they worshiped God falsely. To the Jews, the Samaritans were fallen away Jews, people who turned their back on God, and they despised them even more than the pagan people who surrounded Israel. Jews would not even associate with Samaritans. They avoided them like the plague. In fact, Jews felt that they would become impure if they even touched a Samaritan. And the Samaritans felt pretty much the same about the Jews. So there was no love lost between the Jews and the Samaritans. But here comes Jesus, and he tells the people this parable of the Good Samaritan. And he tells it in response to the question from the scholar of the law, who asks, "Who is my neighbor?" Jesus is asked this question because the scholar has quoted the law of Moses. In the book of Leviticus 19:18, God commands that you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And this scholar wants to know who exactly is his neighbor. Who is it that he must love? By telling this parable, Jesus is stating that all people are our neighbors, and that we should love all of our neighbors, even the ones we don't want to love. This parable would have been very shocking to the Jewish listeners of Jesus, because it would have forced them to change their whole way of thinking. They would have had to realize that all people are their neighbors, and that all people are deserving of their love. And Jesus really gets his point across by using a Samaritan as the hero of this parable. Jesus purposely used someone the Jews would have disliked intensely, and Jesus shows this Samaritan in a very positive light. Upon hearing this parable, the listeners of Jesus would have been uncomfortable, they would have been challenged, and they would have been shocked. But hopefully, they would have also been moved to love all of their neighbors, even the ones they did not like. So who would take the place of the Samaritan if Jesus were to tell this parable to us today? How would Jesus shock us with this parable? Who would Jesus want us to love, even if we may not want to love them? Remember, Jesus wants us to love everyone, so who may we not want to love? What about Al-Qaeda or the Taliban or any other terrorist group? Would Jesus use them as a modern-day Good Samaritan to shock us? Would Jesus tell us the parable of the good Al-Qaeda? What about people closer to home, those whom we may not want to love here in this country? Would Jesus tell us the parable of the good illegal immigrant, the good drug addict, or the good Wall Street embezzler? There is any number of persons whom Jesus could use to shock us with this parable, people whom we probably have a tough time loving as our neighbor. But as tough as it is to love them, that is what we are called to do as Christians. We are called to love our enemies, those who persecute us, those who hurt us. We are called to love the criminals, the outcasts, and the unfortunate among us. We are called to love each and every person just as we love ourselves. All people are our neighbors, and there are no exceptions. This is the message of the parable of the Good Samaritan. So let each of us take a good look at ourselves this day, and let ourselves ask this question: who do I have trouble loving? Each and every one of us here tonight, unfortunately, has prejudices and stereotypes in our way of thinking. Each and every one of us, unfortunately, look down on certain people who are different than we are. Each and every one of us, unfortunately, finds it hard to love certain people. So who is it that we judge? Who do we look down upon? Who do we dislike simply because they are different? Who are the Samaritans in our lives? Let us remember that these people, these modern-day Samaritans, these people we dislike, they are our neighbors. And we are called to love them just as much as we love ourselves. And it may be difficult for us to love them. We may not even want to love them. And we must remember that loving our neighbor does not mean that we agree with them, that we approve of the things that they do, or that we even like them very much. But if we desire to be real Christians, if we want to be like Christ, then we must love them. And we must love them as the Good Samaritan loved the victim of the robbers. Now, this may seem like an impossible task, but let us remember this: nothing is impossible for God. So let us call upon God this day. Let us pray that God will help us love all of our neighbors. Let us ask God to give us the grace and the strength to love all of the Samaritans in our lives. Because when we love our neighbors as ourselves, all of our neighbors, then we are truly following God's will in our lives. And when we follow God's will in our lives here on this earth, then we will live with God forever in the kingdom of heaven. And may God bless all of you.